those who were involved in making it come to life. Join us as we go behind the door.
Good evening and welcome back to another episode of Behind the Door with the Grey Rooms podcast. I'm your host, Brooks Bigley, and with me tonight is the actor of Season 3, Episode 15, Peter Lewis, who stood a bit too close to the painting and is now facing the consequences. How are you this evening, Peter?
Oh, you know me, always facing my consequences, but I'm here, and lovely to be here. Good evening.
Welcome aboard the Grey Rooms Express. It's fun to have you here. We're a baby horror podcast, and you're a legend among, well, I want to say podcasting in general, but especially horror podcasting.
A legend among babies, yes.
You're so modest. So to me, this story that you did with us, it's just very indicative, I think, of kind of more of like what you're familiar with, like a no-sleep story. Mark Taus is just such a fantastic writer at just these really spit-polished and shined quick horror stories, and I know he does stuff on the no-sleep too. Did you find recording this story any different from any other horror podcast stories that you work with?
I was definitely able to slip right into it. It wasn't much of a leap for me. It was my typical shtick of being injured and then playing it up for sympathy for as long as I possibly can. And, oh, no. Oh, feel bad for me and my fate, please. So, yeah, it was my usual bag of tricks, really, which I love.
Do you find when you are recording these characters, do you find that you have more fun with the evil characters? Or do you, in this case, where you're the victim and you have to kind of play up more of certain emotions, what do you fancy more when you're recording?
I do love to, play the victim just as much as I love to play the villain. It's really hard to choose one. It's always sort of my preference, as strange as that sounds, to be the one who gets it in the end. And that can be, in our horror genre, that can be both. Lovely enough. You can be the protagonist and wind up dead at the end, or you can be the villain and wind up dead at the end. There's really no telling. And sometimes the villains will be in the next installment, so of course they can't die.
Well, do you find ever that there's kind of an archetype then of like, so in this story, I'm going to play this badass evil thing or person or entity or whatever. Are there any templates that you follow, like kind of a specific jacket you put on when you're about to do a recording for a good, let's say, character versus an evil character?
I'm sure there are, yeah. I tend to get myself lodged into little wedges of this guy wears the black hat, this guy wears the white hat, and follow that down the road too far, probably. But there's definitely a certain tendency to want to just go full evil when you're given something like, a German doctor experimenting on people, something that's stereotypically, hilariously cackling evil. Though that's probably offensive to doctors everywhere, I apologize. So there's a tendency to want to be just growly and I'm going to cut you up. But I really try to avoid that as much as possible and try to give them something more interesting, which I'm sure ends up being like I want to say Crispin Glover sort of weirdness where you're not really
more
sure.
Methodical, right?
Yeah. Where it's hard to tell exactly where the evil is going to strike is where I try to wear my black hat, let's say.
So it's kind of like scaring on the offbeat instead of on the onbeat almost, kind of changing up your... interesting. Yeah, like I know that because I'm very familiar with the bazillion no-sleep stories that you've done, and it's almost like that's a great practice, I think, for actors in general, that just to have so many stories to be able to work on basically new characters every single week, and sometimes multiple characters every single week that you're cycling through. So you for sure could maybe get stuck in constantly performing the archetype of an evil mad doctor, but it's interesting to be able to then take your own unique personal gift of acting and, like you said, change up a little bit, but do the scare on the offbeat, basically.
Yeah, that's a great way of putting it. Yeah, that's what I aspire to try to do, is just as soon as you think it's going to be that, aha, yeah, here comes the mustache twirl, it's just something weird you've never seen before instead. I'm sure I fail more than I succeed, but
but repetition, man, it's all about repetition. So you'll always succeed. It's all about getting back up after that failure. Do you find then when you're recording, let's say non-horror, because like you do some science fiction podcasts, is that a different beast then in terms of recording? Maybe because now you're doing more of like a narrative story. So you're the same character going throughout each episode. So each week you're needing to remember to put that character back on. Do you find a different process in embodying these characters and recording when you do something, let's say, like that?
there is definitely a sense of like, leaving a breadcrumb trail or a thread to follow through something that has a longer arcing narrative for sure. But I do tend to, and it's probably selfish laziness on my part, I tend to try to use the excuse of living in the moment, no matter what the situation is. So whether I'm 10 episodes into a Dungeons and Dragons adventure or doing a brand new anthology story that's not related to anything, I'm just sort of trying to be in the head of the character in that moment and role play as the character and turn everything into an improvisational exercise rather than a real storytelling exercise. Obviously some of that is scripted, and some of the stuff that I'm talking about for the D&D podcasts is an improvisational exercise, so it doesn't carry over directly. But that same spirit of kind of just trying to live in the story rather than bring a coat that has a certain label on it in with me is definitely what I attempt to do.
I like that. Yeah, and improv is so, I think, important because as humans, we're not scripting ourselves all day long as we interact with people. It is very much improv. You don't know who you're going to meet at the supermarket when you go there, so you can't have your lines prepared, right? You're going to organically respond to what happens. But then, of course, when you have that script in front of you, it is eked out how you're supposed to respond. So you get that improv in, I guess, in how you deliver it, or in terms of the emotion that you put behind those words that you're delivering to still keep it seeming organic. It's so complex, I think, the side that the actors have to go through, because even here in the Grey Rooms, we talk a lot to the authors and not as much to the actors. So it's always like, to the author, how did you come up with the character? How did you write the character this way? Here we are now, we've got you as the actor on the side where there's still a whole other side of the story. How did you embody the character? How did you take, what you saw as just words on the paper and really flesh it out even more so than what the author, not what they had intended, but what they were able to achieve by just writing the words. So you've got a heavy burden on your shoulders, man.
Sure, yeah. Not sure how much credit I deserve for that, but it is a fun part of the process that it was invisible to me. Kind of in the creative process, I started as more of a writer and got more involved in the acting side, and I've really liked to learn how much further you can take it on the acting side than words on a page. It's really interesting to me.
Well, how then did all of this start? Like, I'm sure you get asked this a million times, what was the first thing you recorded? But really just when like was that switch thrown where you said, I'm going to take a mic, put it in front of my face, record what happens and see what I can do with it? Like, where did you start down that path?
Sure, yeah. It was probably earlier on in my childhood, we had a uncle of ours that worked in radio, and he would occasionally send us, like for Christmas and stuff, cassette tapes that he actually had a setup in his home, and he recorded silly fake shows and holiday announcements and stuff like that. And he would send a copy to all of his friends and family, and they were always just lovely. Like, he was actually a professional morning radio DJ kind of guy. And we loved those so much that we got a recorder, like a tape player that you could record directly onto. I forget what acted as the microphone there. It was some fantastic space age 80s technology.
Everything was in the 80s.
Oh, yes. And so we would start to make shows ourselves, just ridiculous. My brothers and sister and I would make shows. And so I had a little bit of that earlier on, and then we lost it, of course, or broke it, or flung it into the woods. And I didn't think about it again until I was probably in my mid 20s, and for some reason my father had bought me a Blue Yeti microphone for a project. We worked at the same company at the time, and so we had a project to do, and I had a microphone all of a sudden. And so I started checking out like LibriVox and places like that to see if there was ever an opportunity for me to do something more dramatic, because I had missed not only the performance aspect, but the recording of silly things and sending them to people was important to me.
And you were writing too, right?
Yeah, I never really stopped writing through all of that. I've always, kept journals and random snippets. So always been trying to find a right way to tell a story, though I'm not sure myself what that story is yet.
Oh, everybody is searching for that one story, of course. It's the human condition. Well, so I was trying to connect the dots, thinking that maybe because you were into writing, writing your thoughts down and, coming up with creativity through writing, that maybe then now you've got the microphone. I was wondering if like your very first few messing arounds, basically of just testing it out would be you reading your works basically, or reading, out loud stuff that you've written. That was basically what I was trying to get at. If that was like what your first early recordings were about, or were you just picking random stories and starting to record? That you said you did like funny scenes and skits though, right? So it was more of an acting.
Yeah.
Okay.
So sorry, I managed to talk my way right around the question there. Absolutely. My first recorded things were probably like around that same time when I got the microphone. We were doing a video series on YouTube just as a total gag. It wasn't meant to be anything really, called Sinister Service Announcements, that were like informational PSAs that, because for years now, humans have been impaling marshmallows and roasting them on a fire and gleefully laughing as we chew their warm flesh. Marshmallows will one day kill you, and you deserve it. And so they were just like quick, watch out for ketchup packets. Don't trust that honey bear. He's shifty. That was probably like the first thing I ever put out there on the internet, basically.
But that is so you. Like, that makes so much sense. That's, like, clearly that was like baby Peter Lewis on his path towards where he is now. I love that. That's really endearing, actually. Can we find that on YouTube?
Yeah, if you search for Sinister Service Announcements, I think you'll find a couple of them.
Okay, interesting.
And thank you. That's lovely.
So, you started out, doing these skits. Your father got you this mic for an unrelated project, basically. What was your first foray into, podcasting in general? Like, No Sleep was not your first gig, was it?
It kind of was, yeah. Like I said, I was poking around LibriVox to see if there were any other dramatic options that I could not have to pay my way into, basically. And while I was on LibriVox, I didn't actually end up helping with any projects there. I'm sorry. I should help the team. I'll get back into it. Pull the ship. But I did see a forum post out there that was actually David Cummings. It must have been around 2013, something like that. And so they were just ended season 2, going into season 3. And David was asking if anyone had some spare time. He was being crushed like a small ant under a weighty steamroller, something probably worded less dramatically.
Yes.
I sent him the Smiling Man, which was like the first Reddit No Sleep story I had ever really heard about. It was kind of how I first got onto the forum. For years, I had been reading the stories there, and I knew about the Smiling Man, which was very popular at the time in 2013. And so I recorded that and sent it to David, and he said, yeah, that's great. Why don't you pick another story? And then at that time, we would, the narrators themselves would find a story on Reddit, and we would message the user on Reddit to ask if we could use the story. And then if we couldn't find them, we just kept it in the vault or whatever. And so I remember he just said, go ahead and pick something. And I think the first one I picked was too short. And so he was like, why don't you do this one instead? And that was Milk and Cookies.
That's right. I remember that one.
Season 3, episode 5 or something like that.
Yeah.
That was my first ever No Sleep. And that was really, 2 weeks after I got the microphone there, my first try back, to get back into it. I got very lucky is the quick summary there.
And Smiling Man also was a story on No Sleep, right? I mean, you said that it was more like you testing it out to send to David to see what you could do, but
It
didn't that?
was. Someone had already read it. It might have been David, so it was already like claimed at the time. I couldn't have it broadcast, but it's out there in the ether somewhere. There's a version that I sent as my first audition. It might even be on my Patreon. I'm not sure.
And the Smiling Man was about, wasn't it like, wasn't the narrator thinking that there was some drunk person like down the alleyway that just kept,
Yeah, he's like walking
yes, yes,
home
yes,
off a
yes.
bus, and there's a man who's just ballroom dancing by himself, and he's smiling, but it's not that classic ear to ear grin, Cheshire cat smile. It's like a very specific, I want to dance with you smile, and it's one of my favorite old stories.
I miss those old stories. I really miss the old. I mean, not that we need to go back to that or try to recreate that or reboot it, but just the simplicity back in those days of the old Reddit stories of the old, like truly when it was still basically speculative fiction.
Yeah.
I miss those classic days. It was just a very nostalgic, classic time. I miss Super Nintendo system. I don't want to sit all day and play Super Nintendo games, but I nostalgically miss those times. So
I'm sure this is naive from an IT perspective, but to get all spooky with it, there seemed to be a point at some time during those early days of Reddit No Sleep where you weren't quite sure you weren't summoning demons. Like we didn't know quite enough about the internet to be sure that wasn't possible.
right, right,
You
right.
could still kind of get away with
Everything was in
that.
its infancy. Yeah. It was just a very unique time. Everything was new. The internet was new. Horror stories on podcasts were new. Writing about them was new. It was all very new. So we were all going through it together, basically. Now
Yeah.
there's third waves and fourth waves, and all kinds of newer authors coming through. It's a different ball game now.
Yeah. We'll often see the comment floating out there, when someone feels like they need to be negative, and that's certainly their prerogative, that there's just a certain magical feeling, in some of the comments. People will say that the newer seasons lack this sort of campfire intimacy, and it's like, yeah, we grew up. I'm really sorry. Like
Right, we
time
evolved.
passed, and things are different now, and I too miss the magic. We're searching
Uh-huh,
for it.
uh-huh.
Not to say we're not still producing. Everyone is producing quality work, but there is a certain, we've learned, we've grown together, and let's accept that.
Right. And that's what I meant by like there is this nostalgia. I do miss those days, but not at all in a way that means it needs to be returned to. It was just part of that growth. You miss your childhood. You don't want to be a child again. I mean, the average person doesn't want to, but you respect and acknowledge where you came from.
And there will be new magic
Yes,
eventually.
exactly. It's more of a bigger concentrated bonfire now. It's not just a tiny little campfire. It's more spit polish to it. I don't know. Yeah, so whatever. People just want to complain because they're having a bad day, and no sleep means a lot to people. Horror podcasts mean a lot to people. We have the same going on with the Grey Room. Some people appreciated more of the rawness in the beginning of our seasons versus like we are also kind of becoming a little bit more polished, trying to incorporate more ideas that everyone will like instead of just kind of like the smaller targeted niche things that we were doing in the beginning. So it's
Sure, yeah.
all part of evolution. What are you working on outside of horror? Like what kind of podcast, or even outside of podcasting, what are you working on right now? If you can share with us.
Sure, yeah. I don't have a tremendous amount outside of podcasting. My life is a very typical 9 to 5 job most days, interspersed with the occasional Animal Crossing session. Or you can find me occasionally on Twitch, occasionally meaning almost every day on Twitch. So that's always a bit of fun. But yeah, mostly we're doing still doing no sleep stuff. I think we're finishing up the 15th season now. We have the Fear Noir podcast with Michael Whitehouse, which is slightly horror themed. There are some supernatural elements, but it is more of a detective noir experience at its core.
White House has always been a very supernatural oriented author, in my opinion, I feel. So that's interesting. An interesting take.
Absolutely, yeah. It's fun to come at his kind of typical, what I would like to call a sophisticated ghost story style of storytelling from a more black and white, noir perspective is really fun. Everything rainy. Ah, I love it.
And this is No Sleep produced?
It's not. It's just Michael Whitehouse's side project at the moment,
Oh,
though.
it's all him. Okay.
Yeah, though you may notice have been some Michael Whitehouse stories that have been featured on the No Sleep podcast, and it is, dare I say, connected in certain ways. So it's not No Sleep under the umbrella of No Sleep, but it is slightly connected to some No Sleep stuff.
Tangential.
To be
Okay.
vague
Got it.
about
Got it. Got it. I like all the tangential vagueness. We totally understand. That's how it works in this podcast industry. Now, what about you're working with Travis and Caitlin on multiple other podcasts too that are like science fiction, right? The Liberty podcasts.
Absolutely, the Fool and Scholar team there, Travis
Thank
and
you.
Caitlin.
I couldn't think
Oh,
of their
I
name.
hate to call Travis out like that.
Well, you know who the scholar is. Yes, yes, yes.
Oh, yes. No question about it. We'll talk about the Fool later. We have the White Vault podcast, which is sort of their flagship production. It wasn't the first that they started down, but it's become, a ripple, let's call it. And my character, Graham Kasner, there pops in and out occasionally. And so that's more of like it's kind of The Thing-esque, set in Svalbard, and multiple seasons set in multiple locations elsewhere. Patagonia, I think the latest one is it had, world stretching and multiple actors and voice actors from different backgrounds speaking their native languages, and me speaking a language which is not native to me, and trying my very best. So that's incredible fun. It's adventure and intrigue and darkness. And then, yes, there's the Liberty side of that. That's sort of a sci-fi, far-flung future, hexagonal cities, and let's not call it dystopia, lest we get the baton. Let's not call it dystopia.
See, I haven't listened to the Liberty podcast yet, but I am a fan of. What is it called? Is it Horizons? What is their other?
Vast Horizons?
Vast Horizons. Thank you. Gosh, clearly I'm not as big a fan as I thought. But I'm familiar with that podcast in terms of the sci-fi that Fool and Scholar is putting out, and I'm blown away by the production of that. Like I feel like I'm a little fly, just kind of floating around in the spaceship, just being privy to these situations, like the encompassing production of it, let alone the acting. The acting just when you forget you're listening to a podcast, then the acting is perfect. I just completely get lost, and I'm totally forgetting I'm listening to a podcast. But the production too, yeah. Travis and Caitlin they are a beautiful team.
Some teams I've had the privilege to work with that crank out, great work, like a printer paper coming out. This is amazing. Look at all these scripts. And then there's Travis and Caitlin, and they're printing, like 3D printing an entire planet. And I'm just looking around from the inside, waiting to see how it all comes together. And it's going to be amazing. Right. The other side of that whole thing, too, is the Dark Dice podcast, which is like actually a Dungeons and Dragons actual play thing, just to mention it.
And you're in that one, too, right?
I am, yeah. And also David Alt is in the first season, I believe, as well as many other fantastic actors.
Okay, I feel like David Alt is in. He's pushing up there with Graham Rowett and being in like all the podcasts.
Oh, they're trying. I hope.
Jokingly so. So yeah, I keep hearing about Dark Dice like through social media, but I'm not familiar myself. How does one do a D&D podcast that way?
Absolutely. I know there's a couple of different ones out there, and there are different theories of it. Something that seems to be a little bit unique about this one is that we kind of cut out, for combat sequences, we cut out a lot of the rolling and all of the mathematics of it, and we try to make it more of an actual cinematic combat sequence. I say I do nothing of the sort. It's all Travis and his team. I'm sitting over here eating Cheez-Its. It's a lot of like the dialogue is completely improvised. So we'll have a situation where Travis, 2 years ago at this point, had led us through a tavern or whatever and said, we have this wizard in the forest to contend with and all that. And then he later has his lines replaced with like other people. I think in the first season, we had Wayne June from like Darkest Dungeon, etc. in Travis's role. And then later, Travis finally learned to love himself, and now he's officially the dungeon master, which I think is fantastic. So yeah, it's very much like an actual Dungeons and Dragons experience, but we're trying to make it as much like a movie or a audio drama as possible, basically, just on the fly.
But it's not recorded live, is it? Or do you guys kind of remote into each other to get that live improvisation going? Or are you just...
It is, yeah. It was done over like Roll20 and a Zoom call or whatever, so we had some maps to look at jointly and a chat to share, book information and stuff like that. But we just turned on our microphones during those sessions and cut out anything we didn't need later. Again, royal we, I did nothing of the sort.
Well, I think that's so great because, and maybe we know this, of course, because we're behind the scenes here, but the fans are always... It's like they're just shocked to find out, wait, that one story where you and Jessica McAvoy performed, like, wait, you weren't in the same room together? And you're like, no, like none of us are ever in the same room together. But you're such good actors that you can still respond accordingly. So when you line up that audio, it sounds like you are. But here you are, you're actually recording live. So my question was going to be like, how the hell can you improvise if you're not live? But by being live, you've answered that question. That leads to that good organic improv that you need to bounce off of each other. Maybe you can't see the other actor, but you can hear them, so you can totally improv off that. I get that now. Well, I know nothing about D&D personally, so I just keep hearing people talk about it lately, and I heard about Dark Dice. I know that we have some fans, like on our Discord, for Grey Rooms that is into D&D, so this will be fun for them to listen to later, I think.
Absolutely. I think those are my only two real experiences with live role playing or whatever you call it. There was one we did similarly in the Liberty universe, a sci-fi D&D variant, and then we did the main Dark Dice thing, and those have been my only two experiences. So I've recorded all of my mistakes, of which there were many.
There you go. So you would you ever want to do kind of like a live situation? Like I've heard like some interviews that you've done before, or like there was something I remember that stands out. It was on SoundCloud. It was something that you and David Cummings, you were doing something, you were talking about something together, but just the idea maybe of you and let's say 4 other actors having a loose script to do something. So like the way that you would do Dark Dice, but instead bringing it back to kind of like that fun, idea that you had when you were younger doing the YouTube videos of just doing the silly announcements. Like, would you ever be keen on doing something like that, like a live comedy troupe performance or something of that nature on a podcast?
That would be amazing. Yeah, like an audio drama Muppet show. I'm in. I'm so
sweet.
in.
Okay, we got to start finding more disciples to follow us on this idea here. Yeah, something I don't know.
Sounds fantastic.
It would be very interesting, I think. I mean, it could never be truly live for an audience, but in terms of the spontaneity that you could have, the funny humor that could transpire from that type of improv situation, I think would be very exciting.
Yeah, so, I would love to do something like that.
Yeah. Before we start wrapping this up here, I wanted to ask if you have anything fun that you're working on, like some kind of future project that you can tease without revealing, or anything new that you might be doing, or that that you might be doing, anything you're interested in. Is there anything that you can basically tease the fans about?
Absolutely, yeah. I know something that just peeked up over the horizon recently has been the official No Sleep Podcast Twitch channel. I've been over there streaming just a little bit so far, but we'll be doing a couple of more joint improvisational things, as the vein of the conversation luckily has led us to. Like some Jackbox party games, say, with the No Sleep team over that way.
Well, yeah, you guys were doing some live stuff in the beginning of the year. Well, the beginning of the pandemic, I remember, going into summer last year. It was like once a week, like 4 or 5 of you guys were logging onto the YouTube together to perform live together. That was a really cool thing, I guess.
Absolutely, yeah. I had the chance to be a part of some of those, and I'm not sure if there was more planned or what, but we still have that going as well, I believe. I hope there will be more live events.
Well, so then what is going on Twitch? When you're referencing Twitch, that you're doing stuff on Twitch, No Sleep is doing stuff on Twitch. What is it that is happening on Twitch?
Sure thing. So far, it's just been like individual No Sleep podcast voice actors, and Olivia, our fantastic COO, has been streaming just individual games and narrating them for fun. So it's just us playing games. We're not doing anything too fancy. And eventually there will be multiple people playing games. I think even some of the streams so far have had more than one voice actor giving commentary, so we're just making fun of each other's poor performance. Thanks, Atticus. Thanks for that. And
I was just going to say, it sounds like something Atticus would do.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So no big deal. You're not missing anything huge, and no sleepy necessarily yet, but once it gets off the ground, we might be doing some more like actual official productions that way. We'll see how it turns out.
That's awesome. Hell yeah. I'm always down for that. Because you guys are such a fun team, all 39,000 of you, because there's so many
Yeah.
No Sleep actors now. But anyways, it's always it's so fun, and I think fans love it so much. Like when you were doing the skits with, oh my goodness, the X, you wrote it, right? What was it? Refresh me.
Yeah, Plan X and like the escape the dungeon thing.
Yes. Doing those things, fans just love that shit because it's so fourth wall, out of the ordinary, and yet still very indicative of how you guys work together. So really, really like that camaraderie that you guys have outside of just, and here's our next horror story to read. You know, you guys have more than just that to offer.
Trying to add a little peek behind the curtain, even though the peek behind the curtain is an absolute farcical lie, but you enjoy it. It's from the heart. I'm lying to you direct from the heart.
Absolutely. This is all, podcasting is all lying. We're all pantsless and we're all lying. That's all that it is.
How did you know? Where is the This interview is over. I am...
Oh, we're done. I'm sorry. I revealed too much.
Just slip these on real quick. Then we can continue. It'll be fine.
All right. Who told you we're not wearing pants? Well, thanks for joining us tonight and explaining why you never want to visit another art gallery ever again. I appreciate you taking the time to sit and chat, Peter, and I thank you for sharing your world with us here in the Grey Rooms.
An absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me, and thank you for allowing me to contribute.
Oh, for sure, yes. Allowed you. We totally just allowed you. You know, there was no threats of violence or bone breaking or anything like that. No, of course.
It'll heal.
Best response ever. And as usual, the biggest thank you goes out to our fans and followers who listen daily and spread the good word of Bob. Art imitating life can be a beautiful thing unless it's directly imitating you. #stay gray. Take care and enjoy your evening, Peter.
Bye for now.
And good night, folks. Bye.
Join us each week after every episode for another edition of Behind the Door.